Washington Journal continues.
At our table this morning, Congressman McClintock, Republican of California, sits on the Judiciary Committee. And I want to get your reaction to Jamie Raskin, a Democrat of Maryland, sits on the committee with you. He was on the program yesterday, and he talked about their efforts, the committee's efforts, to investigate President Trump. Here's what he had to say.
Problem is, this is a president who has essentially ordered everybody in the executive branch not to cooperate with the lawful requests of Congress, not to cooperate with subpoenas. They tried to pull a curtain down over the presidency. And I just ask my friends across the aisle every day, imagine how they would be reacting if this were Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, who said, we are not going to participate in any congressional investigations. The Democrats didn't love the Fast and Furious investigation or the Benghazi investigation, which cost tens of millions of dollars and went on forever, but it was the power of Congress to do that. So we think this affects everybody in Congress, and everybody in Congress should be standing up for our prerogatives.
Congressman?
Well, this might be news to Jamie, but that's been true of every presidency back since before Truman. There is a concept called executive privilege, meaning that conversations with the president are privileged from Congress. Just as Congress's behind the scenes conversations are privileged from the executive. And this has been tested in court many, many times, and the presidency has always prevailed. In fact, the Republican Congress tried to subpoena Truman and his advisors after they had left the White House, and the courts stood with the presidency. Yesterday,
the committee heard, or the day before, on Tuesday, from the Corey Lewandowski, who was the former campaign manager for the president, has not served in the White House. What did you make of the argument that he did not have to talk about his conversations with the president, even though he hasn't served in an official capacity?
Well, he had conversations with the president in the president's official capacity, and that's covered by executive privilege. It's not very complicated. The interesting thing about all of this is the Democrats seem to focus on what Lewandowski had told the Mueller investigation, and that is that the president came to him and said, hey, I want you to go to Jeff Sessions. And I want you, and he needs to say, look, I was the campaign chairman. I know what was going on, and there was no Russian collusion. This whole thing's been very unfair, and the president did nothing wrong. He didn't ask to shut down the investigation, which, by the way, he had the legal authority to do and the constitutional authority to do. He simply said he's got to make a statement and just say this is unfair. That is what the Democrats are currently hanging their hopes of impeachment on. And again, this is a solemn constitutional process. This is literally the nullification of a national election and a decision made by the American people. And they're doing this over the pretext that the president, who had committed no wrongs, the Mueller investigation was able to find no signs of Russian collusion, simply saying, you know, he knows the true story. He needs to go out and have a press conference and tell it. I don't find that particularly objectionable, and I don't think most people do.
The committee is also looking at possible financial misdeeds by the president's violation of the emoluments clause.
They're looking at everything. They're trying desperately to find some excuse to nullify the 2016 election. And if you think about it, that's a pretty dangerous thing. In a democracy, any democracy, in an election, one side or the other is going to go away disappointed. That's the very nature of elections. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Democracies depend on whoever wins and whoever loses. Both sides have to respect the decision of the majority. That's what democracy is based upon. If one side or the other doesn't respect the will of the people, democracy collapses. That's happening today. And that's absolutely frightening. That's only happened one other time in our nation's history. It's when the Democrats refused to accept the election of 1860. And God forbid we should ever go down that path again.
Is it, though, do you have any concern about headlines like this? Pentagon spending $184,000 in 2 years at the Trump Hotel.
Well, as I understand it, that is within the normal per diem that is allowed to soldiers. And they make the choice.
What about, though, that money going to enriching the president?
Well,
it's
been rare when we've had a president who's also been a businessman who owns a number of hotels. But that's not the president's decision. That's the decision of the individual soldiers who are taking their per diem and making a decision on what to do with it.
What about foreign leaders who stay at the Trump Hotel, et cetera? What Democrats are pointing to is that the president is violation.
Well, if they can show that anybody is paying above market rates, well, then they might have a case, but they've not been able to show that.
What comes next, do you think? I mean, you've said, I double dog dare you to bring impeachment to the House floor.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's going to come next is the other shoe is about to drop in this whole sordid affair. For 3 years, our country has been torn apart by this bizarre and monstrous lie that the president is somehow a foreign agent under the thrall of a hostile foreign government. And we now know that was a complete lie. It was based on the Steele dossier, which was a phony concoction of the Clinton campaign. And all of that is, we're now starting to see the investigations unfold with the Inspector General's office of the Department of Justice, and more importantly, the U.S. Attorney's office is looking in to how this lie was conceived, how it was used, and how the most terrifying powers that we give our government were turned against our elections process. I mean, you think about it. The most terrifying powers the government has, the power to ruin your life, to throw you in jail, to bankrupt you, to threaten your family members, to launch pre-dawn SWAT raids on your house. We entrust the government with these powers with the expectation they will be used to protect our freedoms. But we're starting to find out that in the 2016 election, these terrifying powers were turned against our own democracy, first to concoct this lie, then to use that lie as a pretext to launch an investigation, leak the existence of that investigation to the press to influence the 2016 election. And when they failed to do that, became the insurance policy that Peter Strzok was bragging about coming out of Andrew McCabe's office at the FBI. If they couldn't influence and interfere with our election, they would nullify the election. And what you're seeing the Democrats doing in the Capitol right now is the next step in that attempt. But these facts are coming out. As Longfellow said, the wheels of the gods grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. We are going to get to the bottom of this. We are going to see the full story. And if it is true that these powers were turned against our democracy by our own justice and intelligence agencies, that has got to become a cause célèbre, because no democracy, no free civilization can endure with that kind of embryo of a tyranny within it.
We're talking with Congressman Tom McClintock. Join in on the conversation. If you're a Democrat, dial 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. You can also text the Congressman if you punch in 202-748-8003. Just put your first name and city and state. A headline related to what you're talking about in the Washington Times: Watchdog referred former FBI Director James Comey for prosecution after memos leaked, but the Justice Department ultimately decided not to go forward with any charges.
Well, I think that was probably a wise decision. I think they have much bigger fish to fry with James Comey. These were his own notes. Yes, they were classified. Yes, they were the property of the U.S. government. Yes, he broke the law.
Well, it says in the Washington Times the documents leaked by Mr. Comey were sensitive but not classified.
Well, correct, but it was illegal to leak them. He leaked them. But I think that that's a very small story compared with the totality of what he did, and I think the Justice Department is looking at that and realizing we don't need a distraction like this when we have much bigger issues to take up with James Comey and his friends.
When will we learn about the Attorney General's investigation into the Steele dossier? What is the timeline for that?
I can't read minds and I can't tell fortunes.
You don't know as a member of Congress yet?
I don't, but it is very clear that the Inspector General's report on FISA abuse, the lying to a federal court in order to obtain warrants to spy on an opposition campaign using the powers of government. That report, of course, is in the Department of Justice's hands, and we would hope to see that report released to the public in the near future. But I think the far more important investigation is the one being conducted by the U.S. Attorney. because that can look not only into the Justice Department but also into the intelligence agencies. Now, we know that disinformation was fed to George Papadopoulos through Joseph Mifsud, who was identified by the FBI as a Russian operative. Well, we now know he wasn't a Russian operative. He had long established ties to Western intelligence, including a long history with the CIA. They then used the disinformation that was fed by Mifsud to Papadopoulos as part of their justification for this sham investigation, which they then leaked to the press to influence the election. All of this is coming out now, and I think it's going to be a real eye-opener to a lot of folks, and it's going to be a tremendous embarrassment to the Democrats who have continued to peddle this lie long after it became clear that it was a lie.
Let's get to calls. We'll go to John, Berwick, Pennsylvania, Republican.
Yes, I'm a registered Republican, and I'm actually over 70 years old. And I believe all of us that are over 70 knows what it is to actually be conservative, because our parents grew up during the Depression, and they were certainly conservative. To say that a man that went bankrupt attempting to build a place called the Taj Mahal and went through 4 bankruptcies, and to listen to these people on Fox News saying we cannot afford to give a migrant a bar of soap and toothpaste, but we can afford to give the casino owner $1 billion in debt relief. He got $1 billion, and them casinos, they just had an article in the Atlantic City Press about what Trump Marina was like when it was sold. And they said they moved, the employees were moving the plants around to try and catch the water that was running in from the roof when Trump filed for them bankruptcies. To say that a conservative, I mean, if this is their position now, these conservatives, and I'm still a Republican, if this is their position that a conservative on the 1-year anniversary of their 3rd marriage goes out and seeks out the star of a porn movie, he was not satisfied with any just average.
Okay, John, what's your question or point?
Yeah.
What do you want the congressman to respond to?
I think the point he's making is that Trump used a lot of the crony capitalist advantages that have been built into the system over the years. He resents that. I don't blame him. Those crony capitalist provisions should never have been there. These subsidies, the licenses, all of the things that inhibit a free market. But as long as they're there, people are going to use them. And I don't excuse the president's personal conduct, but that has nothing to do with his official conduct. Bill Clinton was a reprehensible individual, but looking back on it, not a bad president. Not a great one, but certainly not a bad one. So I do understand that. But this whole narrative that Trump is just using the White House to, if it's not to help the Russians, it's to help himself. Well, there was this article recently which pointed out the presidency has been a tremendous drain on Trump's fortunes. The rent at all of his hotels has dropped dramatically because there are a lot of people who don't like him and who will boycott those hotels. So the fees are coming down. They're not making as much. I think when you add it up, Donald Trump will have suffered financially more from the presidency than anybody who's ever served.
Joe, Harvey, Louisiana, independent.
Yes. Okay, my thing is, I listened to them say, well, let me go with so many things that said that was wrong. Now, the first thing, let's talk about Mueller didn't find anything looking like collusion. Well, I don't know what you would call it, but I'm saying the campaign manager sharing data with the Russians, I don't see why that's not some form of collusion. I don't see how...
I'm sorry.
Joe, we missed your point about, you said who colluded with the Russians?
Excuse me now?
You said who colluded with the Russians? I'm
saying the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians.
Well, what's your evidence of that? Because Mueller spent $30 million, 22 months, with a team, most partisan investigative team I've ever seen assembled, and came up with no evidence of collusion.
Okay, so Congressman, just let him get to your point, Joe.
Collusion. You saying no evidence of collusion. That's what I'm trying to talk about. Okay, he's saying no evidence of collusion, and that's not true. He did find evidence of collusion. What he didn't find was enough evidence to bring it to court. And one of the reasons he did not find enough evidence to bring it to court, in which he pointed out, was even though he showed where you had over 160 contacts with over 16 people in the Trump administration, so many of them, you had many of them that lied, many of them that claimed with the Fifth Amendment, you had them talking about attorney-client privilege. Many of them destroyed devices. They did everything they could to avoid that. Not taking into consideration all this was going on a year after the campaign. Well, of course, many of these people had returned to Russia and everything else. So it wasn't the fact he didn't find enough evidence that
Okay, Joe, so heard your point. Go ahead.
The president's central responsibility is foreign policy. Of course, they're going to have contacts with foreign leaders after the election, and they certainly did. But even before the election, it is not uncommon for governments to be in contact with all of the candidates. A friend of mine many years ago was a guy named Bob Neeson. He was the U.S. ambassador to Australia. While he was serving in Canberra as our U.S. ambassador, there was an election going on. He used to tell me stories of being in contact with all the candidates because as U.S. ambassador, it is his responsibility to convey to them the positions of the U.S. government, and it was also his responsibility to convey to the U.S. government their views on foreign policy matters. So, to say, oh, well, he had contact with Russians, doesn't say a damn thing. Of course he did. He was the president-elect and ultimately the president of the United States. He's supposed to have contact with all foreign governments and has. The point is there was no evidence of any kind of criminal activity. And this notion that somehow an investigation is supposed to exonerate somebody, investigators don't exonerate. They determine whether or not there is evidence of a crime, and the Mueller team, despite all of their efforts, could not make that case. It's interesting. There is a federal court case going on right now in the D.C. court involving these Russian troll firms. As you know, that's part of the narrative. Oh, the Russian government was interfering in our election through these Russian troll firms. Well, that's actually being contested in court now, and the judge demanded of Mueller's investigators to produce the evidence that these firms had a tie to the Russian government. And Mueller's investigators could provide no such evidence, and ultimately Mueller was forced to draw that distinction publicly. That's why he had that press conference. This whole story has been made up from the start. It is a false narrative, and the more evidence that comes to us, the more it's being revealed as I think one of the most monstrous lies ever told in the history of American politics.
Janice is a Republican, Plymouth, Michigan.
Hello. That last caller just personifies what's going on in this country with the misinformation and the refusal to accept the facts and reality. And they just keep harping on the same things over and over again, and it's all a big fat lie. Anyway, Mr. McClintock, I watched every excruciating moment of that hearing on Tuesday, and I could not believe the Democrats, the anger, and that 30 minutes, whatever that weird thing was at the end of it with the consultant. I mean, talk about out of, I can't even find the word. He had no business sitting up there. And I'm glad the Republicans did not have their own, quote, consultant, unquote, to counter what he was trying to prove. You can't prove a zero. There's no crime to prove.
Okay, let's have the congressman respond.
That's exactly right. They could find no evidence of a crime, so now they switched to, well, there's been cover-up. Well, how do you cover up a crime that never happened? That's the problem they've got in dealing with this. and focusing on Corey Lewandowski's conversation with the president in the Mueller report came up with a big fat nothing. Again, the president didn't tell him to shut down the investigation. The president told him, hey, you remind Jeff Sessions, he was the campaign chairman during that time. He knows what was going on. He needs to say that publicly, that there was no contact with the Russian government, and the president did nothing wrong. This whole thing's been unfair. Why shouldn't he do that? I remember a reporter from The Hill quoted a Wyoming rancher saying, well, we know two things from the Mueller report. That old boy, Trump, didn't steal any horses, but he's certainly guilty of not wanting to be hanged for it.
On gun legislation, there is negotiations happening in the Senate on possibly putting on the floor a background check bill. According to the Washington Times, background check proposal leaves senators baffled. The document, first reported by the Daily Caller, said background checks would be extended to include all commercial sales, including gun shows. The checks would be conducted through a federal firearm license or a newly created class of licensed transfer agents. Sellers could keep their own records of the sale, though they could allow the FFL to store them. Where are you on this proposal?
Well, I mean, I've got no objection to background checks, but I wouldn't put a lot of hope in them. California has a universal background check. And a study by UC Davis and Johns Hopkins that was released in December of 2018 found that California's universal background check had absolutely zero effect on gun-related crimes. So they don't work, and the reason they don't work is the same reason our drug laws don't work. I mean, what makes people think that a criminal, a madman, a terrorist can't get firearms through the underground market? The vast majority of firearms that are already used in crimes are not legally obtained. They're obtained either through theft, through straw purchases, or in the underground market.
Conservative columnist Max Boot, in his column today, yes, we should debate an assault weapon buyback. He says nearly 75% of Democrats support an assault weapons buyback, and an even greater number support a ban on their sale. And he notes this, that it's exact, and a mandatory gun buyback clearly does make sense. He writes, that's exactly what Australia and New Zealand did after horrific mass shootings in their countries. In just 6 weeks, gun owners in New Zealand turned in 15,000 newly banned guns. In Australia, about 650,000 guns were turned in as part of a mandatory buyback in 1996 through 97. The result was a 42% decline in the rate of firearms homicides and a 57% decline in firearms suicides.
Well, I'd have to take a look at that study. That sounds very suspicious. But, let me just point out, we've got 50. First of all, when you say a buyback, it sounds like it's voluntary. That's not voluntary at all. That is the
He's
government.
talking about a mandatory
That
one.
is the government forcibly taking your firearms in violation of the Second Amendment. With respect to assault weapons, they're talking about semi-automatic firing mechanisms. Those are common to many kinds of hunting rifles, of target rifles. They're using a term that sounds scary to actually cover a wide range of firearms that are legally owned by millions of Americans. But let's get to the fine point of it. We have 50 years of experience with various gun control laws. They are very, very effective at disarming law-abiding citizens. They are extremely ineffective at disarming terrorists and madmen and criminals. And when you do that, you end up with a society where decent people are defenseless and the criminal element is as well armed as ever. Don't forget, Mexico has the most stringent gun control laws in the entire Western Hemisphere. Their murder rate is 4 times what it is in the United States.
We'll go on to Ray in Newark, California, Democratic caller.
Good morning. There's so much to talk about, but my original question is, I'm wondering, don't you see the reason for so much suspicion regarding this president and how that triggers the need to investigate to find out, okay, what is actually going on? I mean, do you think it's that the president is doing the right thing by meeting with people like Putin for extended periods of time with no note takers, no translators, or when there is someone taking notes that those notes are destroyed? Don't you see that those are some things that are just not in the interest of, the American people.
Okay, let's get a
Who knows?
response. Let's get a response, right?
Well, again, a lot of diplomacy has to be conducted behind closed doors because of the sensitive nature of the relationships between governments. I remember Barack Obama over a hot mic telling I think it was the Russian ambassador, "You tell Vladimir I'll have a lot more maneuvering room after the election." Again, diplomacy is a communication between leaders. As far as suspicious activity, there is suspicious activity under every presidency. There is always a veil of secrecy around the discussions with the president when the president is trading different ideas, people thinking out of the box, people mentioning options that they off the top of their heads that they would not want to see published. The president needs that kind of dialogue. That's why the concept of executive privilege exists, and that's why diplomacy is conducted oftentimes behind closed doors. I don't like it. I believe what Louis Brandeis said when we pointed out sunlight is the best of disinfectants, but it is certainly not unusual, and it's certainly not suspicious. What does trouble me greatly is the unwillingness of many Democratic leaders to respect our elections process and to respect the will of the American people in the decision they made under our Constitution to elect Donald Trump as president, and the continuing activities to undermine the presidency, to obstruct the presidency, to nullify the decision of the American people. Let's be very clear. That is what is going on, and it is absolutely lethal to a democracy that is based upon respect for the will of the majority.
Washington Post front page this morning, Trump is subject of intelligence complaint is their headline. A whistleblower complaint that has triggered a tense showdown between the U.S. intelligence community and Congress involving President Trump's communication with a foreign leader. Trump's interaction with the foreign leader included a promise that was regarded as so troubling that it prompted an official in the U.S. intelligence community to file a formal whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General for the intelligence community, said former officials. What do you make of this?
Well, I can't make much out of it because there's no substance to it. We don't know who the foreign leader is. We don't know what was said. And most importantly, we don't know if this was true at all. We have been bombarded by the left-stream media with a constant river of allegations that turn out to be completely false. So, the attack on Kavanaugh in the New York Times the other day, I think, is a perfect example of that. This may well be another one. So, I want to see the details, and I want to hear from this anonymous source, and I want to see some evidence, because so far the experience has been these lurid charges have been made up out of whole cloth, and it wouldn't surprise me if this one was too.
According to the Washington Post, the Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson is expected to escalate late Thursday, when Atkinson is scheduled to appear before the House Intelligence Committee. That's today in a classified session closed to the public. The hearing is the latest move by the committee chair, Adam Schiff, to compel U.S. intelligence officials to disclose the full details of the whistleblower complaint to Congress. Maguire has agreed to testify before the panel next week. He declined to comment for the article. That's the Director of National Intelligence, Joseph Maguire, who's the acting Director of Intelligence.
I want to see that out in the open, and frankly, I haven't found Adam Schiff to be a particularly credible source for truthful information on this. Quite the contrary. He has been one of the chief purveyors of a lot of the lies that have polluted our democratic dialogue over these past 3 years.
More to come on that. Congressman, we thank you for your time. We're all out of it. Tom McClintock, Republican of California, member of the Judiciary Committee. Come back again, sir.
Thank you, Gret. I will. Thanks.
Okay.